Before money ruled the world, land did. Empire was measured not in digits or trade deficits, but in the soil beneath one's feet and the blood spilled to defend it. From Rome to Persia, from the Ming dynasty to the Aztecs, power came from territory, conquest was currency. But every empire that expands by the sword eventually discovers the limits of steel. And as swords grew dull, ideas began to sharpen. In the shadows of cathedrals and canals, a new kind of empire was born, one built not by armies but by contracts. The merchants of Venice discovered that gold could conquer more effectively than gunpowder. With ledgers instead of lances, they financed wars, purchased loyalty and charged interest to both kings and conquerors. Portugal was the first to turn exploration into an economic machine. From Goa to Brazil, spices and slaves flowed through Lisbon's ports. The sea became a spreadsheet, routes as columns, ships as assets, and people as commodities. But behind the sails and steel was an even greater power, credit. Every voyage was a gamble financed by bankers who stayed behind while others risked their lives abroad. Spain followed, obsessed not with trade, but treasure. They conquered the New World, flooded Europe with gold and silver, and declared themselves masters of global wealth. But they misunderstood the law of finance. When gold becomes abundant, it loses its value. By the 1600s, Spain was drowning in the very metal it worshipped, bankrupt despite its mountains of bullion. In the misty ports of Amsterdam, the Dutch built something new, the world's first stock exchange. Their empire wasn't fueled by armies but by shareholders. Every Dutch East India ship was financed by investors, traded like modern corporations. The invention of joint stock finance transformed conquest into business and business into empire. Britain watched and learned. It understood that control didn't require ownership, it required debt. While others fought wars over land, Britain financed them. While others expanded territories, Britain expanded credit. By the late 17th century, the Bank of England was born, and with it, a new kind of empire, one built not on conquest, but on confidence. When the Bank of England began issuing paper notes, it did more than simplify transactions, it created trust out of thin air. Gold was replaced by promises, and those promises built an empire stronger than any army. The king now borrowed from bankers and bankers began to rule kings. By the 18th century, the world's map still showed colonies, but behind them stood creditors. The British East India Company conquered India with soldiers paid by loans, and merchants financed wars that reshaped continents. The battlefield had moved from jungles and oceans to ledgers and loans. Debt had become the new musket. Interest, the new cannon. The Industrial Revolution didn't begin with steam, it began with finance. Factories, railways, and machines were all funded by the invisible empire of credit. Britain no longer needed to seize land, it could simply seize markets. And with every new loan, a new form of control spread across the world. Economic dependence disguised as opportunity. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe's great powers believed they ruled through armies and flags. But the real rulers wore no crowns and commanded no legions. They sat behind mahogany desks, signing papers that would reshape the destiny of nations. The world had entered a new era, one where finance would conquer what armies no longer could. The age of conquest had ended. The age of capital had begun. Gold was once a symbol of beauty. Then it became a symbol of power. As empires expanded, gold became the bloodstream of global trade, the one metal every kingdom trusted, the one treasure every ruler feared to lose. But gold had a hidden secret. Those who controlled its movement didn't need to fight for land. They could command nations from afar. By the 1600s, European powers weren't fighting over borders, they were fighting over gold routes. Ships carried bullion across oceans, and pirates became unofficial agents of economic warfare. Every nation wanted to hoard gold because it meant control, the power to fund wars, bribe rulers, and sustain ambition. But soon it became clear there was never enough gold to feed the hunger of empire. Britain saw what others could not. Gold's scarcity was its strength. Instead of chasing it, they learned to control it, creating systems that made other nations dependent on London's reserves. The empire's power wasn't in how much gold it held, but how much credit it could issue against that gold. In London's dark alleys, goldsmiths began to lend receipts for deposits, promises of payment backed by their vaults. Soon, those paper notes became money themselves. It was the birth of a miracle, creating wealth without mining it, commanding nations without ruling them. The alchemists of the New Age were bankers. Every British victory from Trafalgar to Waterloo was financed long before the first cannon fired. The empire's greatest weapon wasn't the navy, but the bond market. Loans to monarchs, interest from colonies, and insurance from Lloyds turned warfare into investment. The more Britain lent, the more the world owed it power. Gold was heavy, paper was light. With paper money, Britain could fund trade across continents without carrying a single coin. It turned faith into finance, the belief that the pound was as good as gold, and that belief made Britain invincible. No family understood financial warfare better than the Rothschilds. By creating a network of couriers and coded letters across Europe, they traded information faster than kings could command armies. When Napoleon fell, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was a financial victory. The Rothschild Empire had proven that money could conquer time itself. By the 19th century, Britain made its power official, the gold standard. Every currency tied to gold, every trade tied to London. Nations that wanted stability had to hold gold, or depend on those who did. The system turned global economics into a single orbit with Britain as its sun. The gold standard promised fairness, but delivered obedience. Colonies sent raw goods and received paper promises in return, while London's banks grew richer. The rest of the world became trapped, feeding the empire's wealth with invisible chains of debt. The colonies had lost their freedom not to armies but to accounting. By the dawn of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. Empires no longer needed to invade, they could invest. Warships became irrelevant when loans could buy governments. And so the sword of conquest was replaced by the pen of finance. The age of colonialism had not ended, it had evolved. Gold was no longer a symbol of wealth, it was a weapon wielded by the bankers of empire. By the 19th century, the real empire didn't sit in Buckingham Palace, it sat behind the stone walls of the City of London. While monarchs ruled by decree, bankers ruled by debt. The city became a nation within a nation, immune from laws, guided by profit, and trusted by no one. It wasn't just Britain's financial heart, it was the empire's invisible crown. Britain's ships carried tea, cotton, sugar, and opium, but the true cargo was control. Every trade route was a vein feeding London's heart of gold. Colonies didn't just export goods, they exported obedience. Each transaction ensured that profits flowed one way, toward the banks. Britain no longer needed to conquer by force. It lent money to kingdoms, built their railways, and controlled their debt. Credit became the empire's most powerful weapon, silent, sophisticated, and endless. Nations that borrowed from Britain soon realized they were never meant to repay, only to obey. Before corporations ruled the world, one company already had its own army, navy, and coinage, the East India Company. It was capitalism's first empire, where profit justified conquest and trade masked tyranny. Every ledger entry marked a life changed, a culture reshaped, a nation subdued. When trade faltered, Britain turned to addiction. The Opium Wars weren't about commerce, they were about balance sheets. By flooding China with drugs, Britain restored its silver flow and secured trade dominance. It was one of the first examples of economic warfare disguised as business. The pound sterling became the empire's lifeline, a currency backed by gold, enforced by law, and trusted by merchants. But that trust came at a cost. To trade globally, other nations had to hold British currency, effectively paying rent to the empire for participation in global commerce. The pound was not just money, it was power in paper form. Factories roared, smokestacks rose, and steel replaced stone. But behind every machine was a banker's signature. Industrialization wasn't a revolution of invention, it was a revolution of financing. Loans built the mills, interest powered the railways, debt became destiny. Some nations were conquered by armies, others by accountants. Loans disguised as development quietly turned entire continents into debtors. Latin America, Africa, and Asia were trapped in cycles of repayment, unable to invest, unable to escape. Britain had found a new empire, an empire of numbers. To the world, Britain promised civilization, railways, schools, commerce, but beneath the speeches lay an unspoken truth. Every colony was designed to serve the banks. Education taught obedience, trade taught dependence, and progress was measured in profit. Colonialism was no longer a mission, it was a business model. By the early 20th century, Britain had built more than an empire. It had built a template, a system where trade, credit, and currency were interlocked, ensuring that whoever controlled finance controlled the world. Even as the empire's flag faded, its banking system endured, ready to evolve into something far more powerful. The empire would never die. It would simply change form. The bankers' empire had begun. When Europe lay in ruins after 2 world wars, a new power emerged, not through conquest, but through credit. The United States became the lender, the builder, and the banker of the modern world. Where Britain once ruled with gold, America would rule with paper, the US dollar. And with it, a new empire was born, the empire of finance. In 1944, as bombs still fell in Europe, delegates from 44 nations gathered in a quiet New Hampshire town called Bretton Woods. They didn't draw new borders, they drafted a new global order. The US dollar would be tied to gold, and every other currency tied to the dollar. The world's wealth was now measured by America's promise. When America abandoned the gold standard in 1971, the dollar seemed doomed. But power adapts, and Washington found a new foundation: oil. By binding Middle Eastern energy sales to US dollars, America ensured that every nation needed its currency to survive. The dollar no longer represented gold, it represented energy, and thus, life itself. The City of London had ruled with banks and ships. Wall Street ruled with markets and numbers. From its skyscrapers, capital flowed like invisible armies, conquering companies, governments, and mines. Stock exchanges became the modern battlefield, and derivatives became the weapons of choice. To the world, the IMF and World Bank were symbols of development and aid. In truth, they were the new East India Company's financial instruments of influence. Their loans rebuilt nations, but their conditions rewrote their laws. Debt replaced the bayonet, and reform replaced occupation. The American empire discovered that it didn't need to invade, it could isolate. Sanctions became the modern siege. By cutting nations off from the dollar, Washington could starve economies without firing a shot. In the age of finance, control of the currency meant control of destiny. The 1990s promised a global village: free trade, open markets, shared prosperity. But behind the optimism lay a deeper truth. Globalization was simply the empire of finance under a new name. Factories moved, wealth flowed, but power remained in the same hands. The borders were open, but the control was centralized. As technology advanced, money lost its form. The empire evolved again from gold to paper, and now to data. Swift networks, credit systems, and digital banking allowed the US to see, freeze, and influence money flows everywhere. The age of invisible conquest had arrived. America promised liberty through capitalism, but what it delivered was dependency through debt. Citizens became consumers. Nations became markets. The illusion of freedom masked the machinery of control. As long as the dollar ruled, true independence was a myth carefully sold at a premium. By the end of the 20th century, the American empire didn't need colonies or kings. It had Wall Street, the dollar, and the global faith in both. The empire that began with muskets now ruled with markets. The crown of power had changed hands from London's gold vaults to Washington's Federal Reserve. The bankers had completed their conquest. When old empires collapsed, the world thought nations were finally free. But freedom came with fine print. Instead of soldiers, contracts arrived. Instead of warships, loans. A new map of control was drawn, not with swords but with spreadsheets. Colonialism had evolved. Its new name was economic development. After World War II, the IMF and World Bank were born under noble intentions to rebuild the world and prevent economic chaos. But soon they became instruments of power. Their loans came with conditions. Policies designed not for nations' growth, but for global financial uniformity, all roads leading back to the dollar. When nations defaulted, the IMF didn't send armies, it sent economists. They demanded cuts, privatizations, and deregulations. Hospitals closed, education suffered, and public assets were sold, all in the name of stability. The empire had found a way to conquer without ever landing a single troop. Countries that resisted faced economic punishment, devaluation, isolation, or worse, starvation by sanctions. Those who complied were rewarded with praise, credit ratings, and short-term prosperity. Debt became both the whip and the reward. Obedience was the new currency of the global order. As governments weakened under debt, corporations stepped in, buying infrastructure, resources, and even political influence. The privatization policies didn't just open markets, they sold sovereignty. The same multinationals that once supplied empires now owned the new world directly. Africa was told loans would bring progress. Instead, it brought dependency. Billions flowed in, yet poverty deepened, because every dollar sent out in aid returned tenfold as profit or repayment. The continent rich in gold, diamonds, and oil remained poor in freedom. In the 1980s, Latin America was strangled by its own debts. Interest rates soared, economies collapsed, and millions starved. The IMF prescribed austerity, but austerity cured nothing. The region learned that debt wasn't a mistake, it was a method. In the East, nations like South Korea, Indonesia, and Thailand rose as success stories until the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Capital fled overnight, economies crashed, and once again the IMF arrived as savior and ruler. Recovery came, but so did dependence, a reminder that every miracle has its master. The empire's brilliance lies in its recycling. Debt never dies. It's refinanced, repackaged, reborn. Each generation inherits what the last could not pay. Nations are trapped in perpetual motion, always paying, never free. And for the bankers, that's the perfect system. Today, no flags are raised, no anthems sung. Yet billions labor under the same principle that powered ancient empires: tribute to the powerful. Only now, tribute is called interest. Colonialism never ended, it simply changed its dress code. The empire of debt rules quietly, invisibly, eternally. The 21st century heralded a new battlefield, the digital realm. Money no longer flowed solely through banks, it flowed through networks, algorithms, and encrypted ledgers. Information became the new gold. Those who controlled data controlled nations, trade, and even perception itself. Physical banks still exist, but their power now comes from networks and systems. SWIFT transfers, international clearinghouses, and digital accounts allow instantaneous control of capital. A keystroke can freeze economies, redirect money, or enforce obedience without a single soldier deployed. The empire now rules invisibly. Traditional sieges relied on walls, armies, and starvation. Today, sanctions achieve the same results digitally. Cutting nations from global payment systems, trade networks, and access to dollars can collapse economies overnight. Power now resides in codes and permissions rather than cannons. Artificial intelligence now monitors the world's capital flows. Algorithms can detect risk, manipulate currency, and predict crises before humans can respond. The empire no longer sleeps, it observes, calculates, and enforces in real time. Finance has become not just global, but omnipresent. Bitcoin and digital currencies promise independence. Yet even these revolutionary systems are absorbed, monitored, or undermined by powerful states and institutions. The empire adapts. Control doesn't need coins, it needs influence over networks and trust. Tech corporations have become the new governors of global finance. Google, Amazon, and Facebook wield influence over trade, data, and credit flows. When banks, governments, and AI collaborate, the financial empire becomes unstoppable, enforcing rules subtly, invisibly, universally. Today, the majority of people are tied to the empire through loans, mortgages, credit cards, and student debt. Even nations owe trillions to international creditors. The pattern repeats. Debt replaces conquest, dependence replaces sovereignty, and the illusion of freedom masks invisible chains. Control now requires eyes as much as money. Digital surveillance tracks transactions, spending habits, and financial behavior worldwide. Banks, AI, and governments monitor, predict, and intervene. The empire sees all. The empire knows all. Crises, pandemics, inflation, or cyberacts are no longer random. They are opportunities for consolidation. Debt, sanctions, and digital rules can reshape entire economies in the blink of an eye. The empire thrives in chaos, expanding silently while nations struggle to survive. The empire has evolved from land to gold, from paper to digital. Its reach is now infinite, its methods invisible, its power unquestioned. Empires of the past conquered with swords and flags. Today, the banker's empire conquers with algorithms, debt, and trust. The pattern is clear. Whoever controls money controls history, and the empire is eternal, quietly shaping the destiny of nations and the lives of billions.